These 6 wide receivers are totally bust-proof in 2023. I've found that over a decade of playing fantasy football, it's good to have a mix of high-ceiling guys and also really high floor guys as a fantasy football strategy. These guys may not have the highest ceilings, but they are definitely some of the safest picks in fantasy football. So the first wide receiver on the list is Stefan Diggs of the Buffalo Bills here, man. So I mentioned in the intro that some of these guys may not have the highest ceilings, right? Obviously, Stefan Diggs has a great ceiling, man. Over the past 3 years, he's finished as the wide receiver 4, the wide receiver 7, the wide receiver 3 in 2022, 2021, 2020. Of course, Stefan Diggs has a high ceiling. But what you also need to notice here with Stefan Diggs is that nothing has really changed since he's been a Buffalo Bill. As you can see on the screen, he is averaging basically the same amount of targets per game every single season for 3 seasons straight, and he's also averaging roughly the same amount of fantasy points per game on a yearly basis. 2021 was a little bit of a down season for Stefan Diggs, but it still wasn't anything bad. Stefan Diggs has such a safe floor because he is also working with a fantastic quarterback. Now, I know that there's been some concern about Stefan Diggs this offseason, maybe about him just not being there for offseason activities, right? I'm just not concerned about this personally, because when you look at Josh Allen and Stefan Diggs, what has been said in the Buffalo Bills locker room by Josh Allen and by other teammates is that they're not concerned about this at all either. In my opinion, the worst case scenario here, and I am talking worst case scenario, is that this is an Antonio Brown and Big Ben type of rift between Josh Allen and Stefan Diggs, where they're both saying really good things about each other publicly, but maybe there's just some rift going on behind closed doors. Even then, Antonio Brown and Big Ben were fantastic in their last year together. Now, I'm not saying that Stefan Diggs is Antonio Brown. Like I said, that is worst case scenario. Stefan Diggs is easily one of the safest picks in fantasy football. He's got a top 8 to 10 floor as far as wide receivers go, and definitely a top 3 ceiling. Now, moving on to number 2, we've got Monroe St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. He's got a very similar situation to Stefan Diggs, I think, right? I don't think that he has quite the ceiling of Stefan Diggs that he's ever proven to us, basically, but not much is going to change, especially at the start of the season for Monroe St. Brown. In 2022, he averaged 9.1 targets per game, 72.6 yards per game, and 13.4 fantasy points per game. And that was his first year as the wide receiver 1 in Detroit. So what also happened was Jameson Williams wasn't there for the very beginning of the season and is stressed into basically the last couple of games of their season last year. So that's exactly what's going to happen again. Jameson Williams is now out, definitely guaranteed for the first 6 games of their season. So they will be missing him again. And that will lead Monroe St. Brown to just be a target hog. And here's the thing about this. Even when Jameson Williams plays, I have argued from day one, since they have drafted Jameson Williams in Detroit, I have argued that this is actually a very good thing for a player like Monroe St. Brown because they are vastly different players. Jameson Williams is a field stretcher. He is going to open up the offense over the middle of the field. Monroe St. Brown makes his money over the middle of the field because he's a great separator and a great route runner, and he is great after the catch. This is going to open up a lot of things for each other. So I actually think this duo is going to be very, very good for each other, and I'm personally excited to see it happen, but that just goes to show that this isn't going to change Monroe St. Brown's value. If anything, it's actually going to make him more valuable because they're just going to be so much more opened up here for Monroe St. Brown. Don't ever be scared of picking Monroe St. Brown. He's definitely got a top 8 to 6 wide receiver ceiling, and with a top 12 wide receiver floor, no doubt about it. Moving on to our next wide receiver, it is T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals, man. So here's one thing I've kind of noticed about T. Higgins. I've noticed that not everyone is as enthusiastic about picking T as kind of I feel like this season. And listen, it's not to say that people think he sucks. You cannot say that T. Higgins sucks, right? Nobody thinks that at all. In 2022, 2021, basically the same amount of targets per game, within 10 yards per game, and basically the amount of fantasy points per game is the same year by year, right? T. Higgins is very consistent, and he's very good. He's being drafted as the wide receiver 14 on Underdog. It's clear that he's not going to bust, right? But what I'd actually argue with people is that I think T. Higgins, with the combination of a couple of different things over the years, right? So when you look at 2021, he missed a couple games due to injury. And then when you look at 2022, very similar thing. He had those couple games where he was actually injured, but he was active and he only played like 1 or 2 snaps. Right? You have those games, and then you have the Buffalo Bills game with the Damar Hamlin injury. I think if we give T. Higgins a full season on a contract year, that is very important for T. Higgins to go out and make some money with a great quarterback. I actually think this is going to be T. Higgins' best season yet. Regardless if he hits his ceiling or not, which I believe is a top 7 to 8 ceiling. You all know, and we all know, that we can count on T. Higgins being a top 15 to top 18 wide receiver. He's not going to bust. Moving on to our next wide receiver on the list, it is Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. Listen, we all know that Amari Cooper is a good wide receiver in the NFL. What I actually think about is, I actually think that he surprised a lot of us in 2022. I mean, he came over to Cleveland from basically being cast away from Dallas for nothing, right? They shipped him off for nothing. And he came out right away and was the wide receiver 9 in half PPR. He was fantastic last year with the combination of Jacoby Brissett and then Deshaun Watson after he hadn't played for over a year. And as you can see on the screen, his averages per game were really impressive. That's really good stuff for a wide receiver on a brand new team and with a very unstable quarterback situation. And the problem really is here that Deshaun Watson, he wasn't good when he came back from suspension. We all know that he wasn't playing good football. But here's what I've been saying kind of all offseason about this. With Deshaun Watson, we need to let a full season play itself out before we really make a final judgment on how we believe he is going to play moving forward. Because it is hard to expect somebody who missed over a full season come into the mid-season on a brand new offense with a brand new system and a brand new team around you to come in and play excellent, right? It's hard to pick up where you left off in that situation. Because now Deshaun Watson and Amari Cooper have had a full offseason to train together, right? And they have done that. They have a full offseason to build more chemistry. I think we're going to see a Deshaun Watson that's very different from what he was last year. And I think that we're going to see the same professional Amari Cooper who is going to come in and be consistent and be a bust-proof player in your fantasy team. Moving on to our next wide receiver, it is the newly signed DeAndre Hopkins of the Tennessee Titans, guys. It is official. DeAndre Hopkins is going to wear a Tennessee Titans uniform in 2023. He signed a 2-year deal worth $26 million. And honestly, when I get down to it, I am a little bit disappointed when it comes to Treylon Burks' 2023 outlook. I will admit that, right? But more than anything, more than being disappointed for Treylon, I'm more confident saying that DeAndre Hopkins is a bust-proof player this year. I know that everybody's going to come into this situation like Ryan Tannehill. That offense just isn't that high of a ceiling. And I'll address that in a minute. But first, let's look at what he did in 2022. Because there's a lot of people saying that he's maybe fallen off. In 2022, when he was active and healthy, 10.7 targets per game, 79.7 yards per game, at 13.3 fantasy points per game. And that was all done with Kyler Murray and Colt McCoy and Trace McSorley. So look at it from that face value. And it's, guys, we cannot say that DeAndre Hopkins is falling off. That notion is just untrue. Now again, to address Tannehill, I don't love Ryan Tannehill personally. I actually don't doubt that Will Levis could absolutely step in at some point during the season and be the starting quarterback. But what I also don't doubt is DeAndre Hopkins coming in and being a professional player as he always is. He is a very highly regarded professional in the NFL, and he is going to be a safety blanket for whichever quarterback throws to him. He's going to be a very bust-proof wide receiver in fantasy football this year. We can expect a floor of top 15 to 18 wide receiver with a top 10 ceiling. And moving on to our last guy on the list, it is Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So here's the thing about Christian Kirk. When I was looking into him about 2022, I was actually a little bit surprised when I saw his numbers. He was the wide receiver 11 in 2022 in half PPR. And here's what he did. 7.8 targets per game, 65.2 yards per game, and 11.8 fantasy points per game. Now those numbers didn't surprise me. It was the wide receiver 11 finish that actually surprised me. Because there was a combination of Evan Ingram, Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, right, Travis Etienne. There was a lot of moving pieces in Jacksonville that were very relevant in this offense. Now, of course, the big elephant in the room now is Calvin Ridley, right? And I understand there's a lot of hype going on with Calvin Ridley, and I can understand he's a good player. I have personally been very vocal about my distrust for Calvin Ridley having a good season. I just don't think it's a good idea for us to put all our eggs in one basket thinking that this guy is going to be great when he hasn't played a full season since 2020. But aside from that, even if Calvin Ridley comes in and he's really good and he stays healthy for the full year, remember Christian Kirk's contract. Just a year ago, he signed a 4-year, $72 million deal with $37 million guaranteed. At the time, that sounded crazy to all of us, right? That sounded like a typical Jacksonville Jaguars signing. Now, after his season last year, it doesn't sound quite as insane. But what it ultimately tells us is that Christian Kirk is not going to just come in and just take a backseat behind Calvin Ridley. That is just not going to happen. What I think is going to happen is it's going to be a very similar situation to what DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett have been for years now in Seattle. I think we could be looking at a season for both Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk that are around top 20 to 25 wide receiver seasons. I think that Christian Kirk is going to be the wide receiver 1 in fantasy in this offense, though. I look at him as having a wide receiver 15 to 20 floor with top 12 upside, and that's why Christian Kirk is bust-proof. And if you are going through your fantasy football draft here soon, and you are picking from ranges 10 to 12, click on this video right here to see the best draft strategy for that range.